Hello, anatomy. Welcome to our third video in our three-part video series on Chapter 3, the nervous system. So just to remind you, in our first video, we talked about the sort of structure and function of neurons, of nerve cells, of the nervous system in general, and how action potentials are carried through a nerve cell, and then between nerve cells through synapses and neurotransmitters. In our second video, the one that was really short, we discussed how drugs affect the brain, particularly with addiction to opioid medications. And here in this third video, we're going to discuss the brain itself and the cranial nerves. Okay, so let's just get started. So regions of the brain. So if you look at this image of the brain, there's four main regions. There's the cerebral hemispheres, or the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So if you look at the picture, most of the mass of the brain are in the two cerebral hemispheres, which are collectively called the cerebrum. The diencephalon's this part, it's inside the brain. You'd have to have a cross section to see it. This part here, the cerebellum is a sort of cauliflower-shaped structure on the lower back part of the brain, and the brainstem is this, in this image, the green part in front of the cerebellum. So let's go through these one at a time. So the cerebrum, again, this is when you look at a brain, this is mainly what you see. There's paired left and right halves. Includes more than half the mass of the brain. So the terms gyri and sulci. So a gyri is a ridge, a part of the brain. The brain looks very wrinkled, right? It's a ridge that extends upward. A sulci is a groove. So if you look at this picture of the brain, and let's actually make it bigger. So like you have this sort of this feature called the central sulcus that goes across the brain like that. In front, you have, for example, the precentral gyrus, which is a ridge. The postcentral gyrus would be a ridge behind the central sulcus. When we dissect brains in class, you can take your finger and just move it into a sulcus and split the brain into parts. A fissure is a very, very deep sulcus. There's a longitudinal fissure that divides the brain into equal left and right halves down the center. Okay, more about that later. So in terms of the cerebrum, like I say, a fissure is a deep groove in the brain. The lobes of the brain are named based upon the bones that they're under, so these names should sound familiar. So the frontal lobe would be the lobe in the front. You have the parietal lobes on the top. The occipital lobe is the one in the back, and the temporal lobes are the ones on your temple. And again, you can see there are pretty deep fissures that separate the lobes. Again, with your hand, you can just break the brain into lobes. The brain's not a very robust organ. It's very easy to tear it apart. So we've seen a picture like this just a few minutes ago. So we're not gonna go into that much detail on the regions of the brain and what they do, but it's worth pointing out. So if you look here at the central sulcus, so in front of it, you have what's called the primary motor area. Motor would be the parts of your brain that send signals, say to your lungs or to your glands. Behind that is the primary somatic sensory area, which would be the part of the brain that receives signals. So like if you're receiving a signal, if you're looking at something, that might be received in the primary somatic sensory area behind the central sulcus. And in front of it, if you see someone hand you something, so you reach out to grab it, that signal would be sent through the primary motor area in front of the central sulcus. So some other parts of the brain, just to point out, this area called Broca's area, toward the front of the brain, that would be the area of the brain that's responsible for speech. The olfactory area here, olfactory means smell. So this is the part of the brain that's responsible for smell. The auditory area here would be for hearing. The visual area here would be for seeing. The gustatory area would be for taste, for tasting things. So we're not going to go into, again, that much detail about what parts of the brain do what, but it's just worth pointing out that the brain is specialized into different functions, as you can see in this diagram. Okay, so the second region, the diencephalon. So this region, again, is sort of like, if you picture a mushroom, the mushroom cap is what you see. The stalk of the mushroom that's surrounded by the cap might be sort of like the diencephalon. So there's three main parts. There's the thalamus, there's the hypothalamus, and there's the epithalamus. In this picture, This purple structure here is the diencephalon, which includes all three parts that are listed here. So this diagram, I know this is a very complicated diagram, but this points out the features we just talked about. So the thalamus, again, is this sort of dark purple region right here. It encloses what's called the third ventricle. We'll discuss ventricles in a minute. The hypothalamus is beneath the thalamus. Hypo means under. It's this sort of, I don't know what you call that, darker or lighter purple. That's sort of more of a vibrant purple, I guess. What's notable about this is the pituitary gland, which is this sort of stalk-like gland that hangs down from the hypothalamus. Again, the pituitary gland is beneath the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, in a lot of ways, controls the pituitary gland. The epithalamus, which in this diagram this shows the pineal gland, which is a gland right here. The epithalamus forms the roof of what's called the third ventricle. It's this sort of that purple region there. And this region sort of on top of the thalamus. A ventricle, we should discuss this right now. So your brain has regions called ventricles, which are basically just cavities that are filled with fluid. The fluid that they're filled with is called cerebrospinal fluid. We discussed this, I think, in the first video. This word choroid plexus. Choroid plexus is that how you say it in plural? I'm not sure. Plexi. But they're regions of each ventricle that produce cerebrospinal fluid. Which again, this diagram shows the third ventricle, so there's 4 of them total. And they produce the fluid and they circulate it through the brain in these cavities called ventricles. Okay, so the 3 parts of the diencephalon. So the thalamus, we're going to go through these we're just going to kind of hit the highlights. The thalamus is sort of like a relay station. So, you know, your brain is flooded with different sensory inputs, and the thalamus basically decides where to send signals to. It's sort of like an old-timey phone operator or a relay station to send signals. And it sort of interprets roughly what the signal is and decides where it should go in the brain. The hypothalamus is under the thalamus. Your hypothalamus, think of it as it's sort of like the master control region for homeostasis. Your book calls it sort of like a thermostat. So your hypothalamus helps regulate things like your body temperature, your water balance, your metabolism. It helps keep you balanced in terms of homeostasis. It also houses the limbic center of your brain. The limbic center is the sort of the emotional center. So, you know, things like hunger and thirst, those originate from the hypothalamus. And like I said earlier, hanging down from the hypothalamus is a gland called the pituitary gland. It's this one, this sort of pink one right here. The pituitary gland produces many different hormones that regulate your body's functions. And the hypothalamus also produces a couple of hormones, but it directly regulates the pituitary gland. It can kind of dial it up or dial it down for the different hormones that it produces. So we had the thalamus, and beneath it was the hypothalamus. The epithalamus is sort of above it. Again, in this picture, the pineal gland is right here. And this region on top of the third ventricle is called the epithalamus. The pineal gland, again, is another endocrine gland that we'll see in chapter 8, I believe. So, you know, I said a minute ago, there are 4 ventricles of your brain, those sort of cavities that produce cerebrospinal fluid. The epithalamus is the roof of the third ventricle. And this structure also includes the choroid plexus, as I mentioned ago. Those are the things that produce the cerebrospinal fluid. All 4 ventricles have them. The epithalamus houses the one for the third ventricle. Okay, the brainstem. We're not going to go into that much detail on the brainstem. I just want to point out that it's what attaches the brain to the spinal cord. It has 3 parts. There's the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. You should know that those 3 parts are part of the brainstem. Oftentimes there might be signals that don't go to your brain, they go to the brainstem, and the brainstem decides what to do with them. Not every signal goes to your brain. Some might just go to your spinal cord or to your brainstem for interpretation and integration to see what should be done about those signals. Okay? Okay, cool. So the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, again, is this sort of cauliflower-like region on the lower back of the brain. It has two hemispheres that are highly wrinkled, kind of like your brain is overall. The cerebellum is responsible for, you know, your physical balance, coordinating your body movements. Sometimes it's kind of nicknamed as an autopilot, because it's sort of like, you know, if you're sort of just running on instinct, you know, if you're walking up the stairs without thinking about it, you're just going up the stairs. Your cerebellum is controlling your body coordination so you can do that. You know, it's voluntary movement because you're deciding to go up the stairs. A lot of it, you know, you're not controlling it that consciously, you're just doing it, and your cerebellum controls that. Okay, so that's your brain. So like I said a minute ago, your brain is a very fragile and delicate organ. So your body has lots of pretty sophisticated defenses and protective layers of the brain. Some are more specific than others. So there's 5, and from outer to inner, there's your scalp and your skin, there's your skull and your vertebral column, meninges, which we'll get to in a minute, there's the cerebrospinal fluid, and there's what's called the blood-brain barrier. We're going to go through all of these right now, okay? Actually, your scalp and your skin and your skull and vertebral column we're not going to discuss, because I think it's pretty clear how your skull protects your brain. So we're going to skip to the third one, to your meninges. So meninges are connective tissue membranes. We saw these in chapter 3, right? So there's 3 different layers of meninges. The outermost is called the dura mater. The word means tough mother. In Latin, dura mater. So it's a double layered membrane. Like we saw this theme a lot in chapter 3. The periosteum is the layer that attaches to the inside of your skull, and the meningeal layer is a layer that actually makes contact to your brain. If you look, I'm going to skip ahead for a second. This sort of grayish area here is called dura mater, and again, it touches the inside of your skull. Again, there are 3 of these meningeal layers. The middle layer is called the arachnoid layer. It's sort of spider-like. You can see in this picture. Actually, it's not in this picture. Sometimes cerebrospinal fluid might, and actually this is by design, it's meant to do this, might leak out of your brain, and it's reabsorbed by the arachnoid layer. The pia mater is the most delicate. It's the internal layer. It's the one that actually makes contact to your brain surface. So from outer to inner, it's dura mater, then the arachnoid layer, and then the pia mater. Okay? Okay, cool. Actually, here you can kind of see the arachnoid mater here. You can kind of see how it's kind of cobwebby looking. Okay, cool. So cerebrospinal fluid. So we haven't discussed blood that much, but the liquid component of blood is called blood plasma. And it is similar in structure and composition to cerebrospinal fluid. Remember I said there were those 4 ventricles of your brain. Each ventricle contains what's called a choroid plexus, and those produce this fluid. It's sort of like a watery cushion that protects the brain. You want to keep the cerebrospinal fluid moving. Remember those cells back from the first video, the ones that had the cilia, they beat back and forth to keep the cerebrospinal fluid moving. That fluid can get infected. You know, you've heard the term meningitis, can be a viral or bacterial. Meningitis would be an infection of your meninges, which obviously could be very, very serious. It can infect your brain or your spinal cord. Your meninges also extend down to your spinal cord. Okay, cool. If you ever heard of a spinal tap, if you have issues with your cerebrospinal fluid, because it goes down to your spinal cord, you can put a needle in your lower back and extract some cerebrospinal fluid. Again, it's called spinal tap, to see if you have an infection, if you have like meningitis or an infection of your cerebrospinal fluid. So the last one, the blood-brain barrier. So the definition is the least permeable capillaries in your body. So we haven't done the circulatory system yet, but we've discussed how capillaries are where nutrient exchange happens. So like your capillaries exchange nutrients or waste to your tissues, right? Oxygen goes from maybe your blood into your tissues. CO2 goes from your tissues back to your blood. Capillaries are very, very thin. They're meant to exchange things with your tissues, right? If your capillaries are too thin, or if they're too sort of leaky, you might exchange too much stuff, right? Well, in your blood, that exchange needs to be regulated pretty strictly. And the blood-brain barrier consists of the capillaries in your brain, which are not especially permeable to stuff. They're much more strict than other capillaries. Many harmful substances cannot get into your brain because the capillaries don't let them through. After you've eaten a meal, your blood sugar fluctuates big time after you eat because you just ate. If your brain cells, if your neurons glucose levels fluctuated that much, your brain will just go crazy. So things that get through the blood-brain barrier with no problem, you can read these. Fats and fat-soluble molecules can get through. Respiratory gases, things like oxygen and CO2, they can get through because, again, if your brain's starved for oxygen, that's going to be bad. Alcohol gets through no problem. So alcohol can affect your brain very easily. Nicotine, like in cigarettes. Anesthesia obviously gets through the blood-brain barrier easily because that can give you anesthesia to put you to sleep. Things like glucose or proteins have a harder time getting through. So this is a defense system because it helps regulate what gets into your brain much more strictly than other capillaries in your body. So a quick note on traumatic brain injuries: concussion, contusion, and cerebral edema. So this goes in order of less serious to most serious. So a concussion, your generation is very familiar with concussions, is a slight brain injury. So the book says no permanent brain damage. So I don't want to mislead you. So typically speaking, a single concussion does not lead to permanent brain damage. There are exceptions to that, but usually a single concussion, you heal from, you recover from, no problem. Multiple concussions, especially if they're close in time, can definitely lead to permanent brain damage. So I don't want you to think that concussions are harmless and you just heal them. They can definitely, especially in sequence, cause permanent brain damage. A contusion, the word contusion just means bruise. So a contusion would be where you have a brain injury, where you have damage to the tissues, so the nervous tissue, and nervous tissue doesn't regrow. If you get a cut in your skin, those cells go through mitosis and you will repair the injury. Nervous tissue doesn't do that. If you damage it, the damage is permanent. A cerebral edema just means a swelling. This would be if you have a pretty serious head injury and you get swelling on the brain, which initially you might not even realize you have a problem, but if the swelling continues, it compresses the brain, puts pressure on the brain, the nervous tissue, and it can cause nerve cells to die. So a cerebral edema can be very, very serious. A cerebrovascular accident or a stroke. So you've heard of strokes before. Strokes are a very serious condition. I think it's the third most common source of death in the United States. I think it's the third. So basically, a stroke is when the blood supply to your brain gets cut off. So it could be a ruptured blood vessel or it could be a blocked blood vessel. If your brain is starved for oxygen, after a few minutes, the nervous tissue dies. If you look at the two words in the third point, hemiplegia and aphasias. So oftentimes when you have strokes, and we're probably going to discuss strokes in a little more detail in class, you might get one side of your face or body gets paralyzed to where your speech gets slurred. Maybe you can't move one arm versus the other arm. That's a classic sign of a stroke, slurred speech, or like one eye gets droopy. Aphasias are when you have problems speaking. You can't speak clearly. That's also a good symptom of, not a good, it's a clear symptom of a stroke. Again, it's when your blood supply to your brain gets cut off either due to a rupture or a blood clot. Alzheimer's disease is a progressive degenerative brain disease. This is a big area of research today because, when I was a kid, people really didn't know what caused Alzheimer's, and now we know that it's largely caused by this third point, abnormal protein deposits on your neurons. And with Alzheimer's, it usually is with people who are elderly, but it can begin in middle age. it begins with memory loss. It will lead to irritability, confusion, where you don't know where you are. You forget your family's names, and by the end, you might forget who you are. You have pretty bad hallucinations, and eventually, you will die. You'll die from it. There's no cure for Alzheimer's disease. It's a progressive degenerative disease, which again means it's not going to get better. So your spinal cord. So one point I want to make real quick. So up until now, I realize I've probably been using the term spinal cord and spinal column interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. Your spinal column is what we discussed in chapter 5. In the chapter on the bones, your spinal column are your vertebra, or the bony part of your backbone, right? The spinal cord is the actual nervous part. So spinal column are the bones, spinal cord are the nerves. I'm pretty sure I've been using them interchangeably, but I should not have been. I should have been more specific. So your spinal cord starts at the foramen magnum, the big hole in the base of your skull, and extends down to either the first or second lumbar vertebra. It doesn't go all the way down to your tailbone. It provides two-way conduction to and from the brain. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Those are nerves that actually start from the spinal cord, and they'll go out to your arms, your torso, your legs. The cauda equina, so this region at the very base of your spine, the term cauda equina looks kind of like a horse's tail, because those are spinal nerves at the base of your spine. They're important because they don't, the spine stop originating from your spinal cord around the first or second lumbar vertebra, but some of them have to extend all the way down before they actually leave your spinal cord, or your spinal column, I should say. So your cranial nerves, so you have 12 pairs of nerves that originate from your actual brain. We're going to go through them in a minute. They mainly serve your head and your neck, things like your eyes, your ears, your nose. Only one of the pair, your vagus nerves, which we'll go through in a minute, go through your thoracic and abdominal cavities. So the 12 cranial nerves, so we're going to discuss these in various degrees in class. For right now, I just want to go through what they are and what they do. So your book gives this mnemonic, O, to touch and feel very green vegetables. It's not, I never found that mnemonic to be particularly helpful. But the 12 cranial nerves, and like you number them 1 through 12. So the first one is the olfactory, the second one's the optic, right? Let's just pronounce these real quick. So there's the olfactory, the optic, the oculomotor, the trochlear, the trigeminal, the abducens, the facial, the vestibulocochlear, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, the accessory, and the hypoglossal. Those are the 12 cranial nerves. So in terms of what they do, and again, I'm going to decide in class how much of this that I want you to know. For right now, let's just name them and say what they do. So the olfactory nerve is for your sense of smell. And again, all these originate in your brain, and they go mainly to things in your head and your neck. The optic nerve is for your eyes, for vision. The oculomotor nerve serves the muscle fibers to allow your eyes to move back and forth. The trochlear, also, those are nerves that will innervate only one muscle, which is a muscle in your eye. The trigeminal nerves, and again, just so we're clear, all these come in pairs. You have 2 of each. These are the sensory nerves for your face. They allow you to chew. The abducens also go to motor fibers in your eye muscles. Lots of nerves affect your eyes. Your eyes are very, very complicated organs. The facial nerve is for taste and some of the motor fibers in your face. The vestibulocochlear nerve is for hearing and for balance. Your equilibrium, your balance is also, your balance is balanced, is controlled in your inner ear. The glossopharyngeal ones are for taste and the motor fibers of your pharynx, your throat. The vagus nerves are motor and sensory fibers for your pharynx, your larynx, and the viscera. That just means the organs of your abdomen. The pharynx, again, is your throat. The larynx is your voice box, and the viscera would just be referring to your abdomen, basically. The accessory nerve is for your neck and upper back, and the hypoglossal nerve is for the motor fibers in your tongue. Okay. So we began, or in the first video, I showed you this flow chart. So we've done the brain and spinal cord. We've done the central nervous system. We've discussed the structure and function of nerves and the peripheral nervous system. So the sensory part of your nervous system is just, you sense things, send the signals to your brain through an afferent neuron. The brain decides what to do with it, and then it sends signals via motor neurons to either your muscles or your glands. So a somatic motor neuron controls muscles. They're voluntary. Muscles like your skeletal muscles, not like your heart. Autonomic motor neurons affect either your heart, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle, maybe in your digestive system, or maybe different glands. They're involuntary. And I said back in the first video that category is further subdivided into parasympathetic and sympathetic, and I said we would come back to that later, and later is now. So the two subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system are sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? We've already discussed the rest of the things on this slide. So, this just shows a good review. So the somatic, the nerves that affect your skeletal muscles, again, they affect your skeletal muscles. There's no subdivisions. Acetylcholine is a common neurotransmitter. The autonomic ones would affect smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, or your glands. It has two subdivisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and it uses acetylcholine, epinephrine, or norepinephrine. Don't worry about the different neurotransmitters that they use. Okay, so what's the difference? So your sympathetic autonomic nervous system is nicknamed the fight or flight response. I like to think of the sympathetic division as taking a dial and turning it up, right? Turn up the volume. So these are things that typically would stimulate you. So think about your, someone's about to punch you in the face, and you either are going to respond by punching them back, or you're going to run away, right? It's the fight or flight. So it's sometimes called the E division: exercise, excitement, emergency, embarrassment. These are things that increase your metabolism. They increase your heart rate, things like adrenaline, epinephrine. They get you ready to either fight something or run away from it, fight or flight. That's the sympathetic nervous system, right? The other half is called the parasympathetic nervous system. So these are called housekeeping activities. These would be things that sort of chill you out when everything is fine, when you're just chilling, helps conserve energy. Your necessary daily body functions, you're probably not daily getting into fights with a robber. Daily things would be digestion, defecation, which is going to the bathroom. Diuresis involves, your kidneys, how much you might urinate. These are just daily functions that you need to maintain when you're chill. So generally speaking, sympathetic things turn the dial up, parasympathetic turn it down, all right? For example, one thing going back in the fight or flight response, let me give you an example. It decreases blood flow, it shunts blood flow away from your digestive organs, right? So in the fight or flight response, you don't need to be, defecating. You don't need to be going number 2 when you're fighting off the robber. So, your body sort of turns those systems off, right, in fight or flight. Parasympathetic turns systems like that on because they're just daily housekeeping activities, right? So going back to this diagram, you have the motor system, the autonomic system. Parasympathetic dial things down, sympathetic dial things up. Parasympathetic is housekeeping, sympathetic is the fight or flight. Okay, all right. So let's end with this slide. The book has a whole section on developmental aspects of the nervous system. So the first month of embryonic development, the nervous system starts to be formed. It's formed very, very early. Any maternal infections can be very harmful. Things like drinking or smoking when a woman's pregnant affects the nervous development of the fetus. One of the last regions to develop is the hypothalamus. And again, once you're born, you don't form more neurons. The first couple years of your life, neurons do grow and mature, and they form new connections. But once you're born, you don't. The number of brain cells you're born with is what you're going to have the rest of your life. Or obviously, you can have fewer of them if they die. As a young adult, the brain reaches its maximum weight, and once you're in your 30s and on, your brain actually loses mass, which is very inspiring. So on that note, we're going to end. Hope that was helpful, and I will see you guys next time.